All right, well, thanks for being here with us this morning. Thanks for watching online. If you've been with us for a little while, you probably know that we like to take our messages here and package them in a series, kind of like how on TV there are episodes and a show. It's part of a bigger series. That's what we normally like to do around here, but today we're going to talk about something all by itself that's really kind of in a category of its own this morning. But before we go into it, I'll tell you a little story, all right? So not too long ago, I was home with my daughter, probably a few years ago, and I was bargaining with her, probably trying to get her to clean her room or some kind of chore or something like that, but maybe go to bed, not totally sure. But there came a point where we had, agreed on the terms of the arrangement. And I put out my hand and I was like, all right, deal? And she goes, deal. And I put out my hand and she just kind of looks at it like, what are you doing? And I was like, oh, you have to shake my hand because we're making a deal. And she puts out her hand and she goes, why? And I stopped and thought about it and I thought, it's a pretty weird thing, Have you ever stopped to think about how weird some of the things are that we do? Like, why, when you make a deal, do you just shake someone's hand, And there's usually a certain amount of appropriate shakes. After a few shakes, it's like, why are you still shaking my hand? Have you ever thought about how weird it is that when you meet someone or you see someone and you want to express that you're happy to see them or recognize them, you just put a hand in the air and you just shake it, you just wiggle it, and that means hey, I'm happy to see you, right? Have you ever thought about how when you see someone you haven't seen in a long time, depending on how you interact with people maybe you just grab them and just press your body up against theirs, It's a weird thing. In fact, if you've been an outsider in certain cultures where you're not familiar with those things, like if you've ever been to Europe, and in some places in Europe, when they say hello, they'll kiss you on both sides. If you're not ready for that, that could freak you out, There's a lot going on right there in your personal space. It's totally normal to us if it's part of our culture, if we're on the inside. But if you've ever been on the outside, things that are normal can seem pretty outrageous, pretty weird, right? Well, the same thing is true in the church. And if you've grown up in church, you've been in church forever, you're used to everything, this is just the norm, and maybe there are a few tweaks from church to church, right? But for the most part, you get it. If you're new, though, there are some things that are just different, right? That you don't do in other places. Where else do you get together with a bunch of people and just sing? Maybe a concert. But other than that, if we were in my backyard and I was like, hey, before we take out the burgers, let's just stand and sing. You'd be like, okay, we'd be the weird neighbors, that would be, but we do it here. Everybody gets up and we sing. Praying. Praying is a pretty weird thing. Praying in a setting like this can be weird. You have somebody up front who's saying something to God on behalf of everybody else. That could be a really strange thing. The idea of communion, if you're familiar with that, can be a really strange thing. In some churches, you just kind of line up and everyone has a really, small piece of bread all at the same time. And yeah, that's kind of a weird thing if you don't know why. But with the church and with us specifically as a church, at least I could speak for us, you should never be afraid to ask why. We believe, part of how we understand God, or try to at least, is that he's a reasonable, logical being. And the things that he asks us to do are rooted in some kind of purpose. And so if there's something you see, you should never ever hesitate to ask why. In fact, there's a group of people written about in the New Testament who went home and double-checked everything they heard to see if it was true. And they were commended for being skeptical. Something that's really helped me in my own personal faith is just questioning everything. Because when you get to the answer, it has this way of kind of grounding you, right? So there are weird things, but when it comes to the weird things in the church, I can't tell you why we wave like this or why I could shake you like 2 times, but if I shake your hand like 6 or 7 times, you're like, let go, right? I can't tell you the reasons for those things, but what I can tell you is some of the reasons why we do some things here in the church. One thing that's strange, all right, is baptism, Like, and I don't know, depending on how you were raised or what you're familiar with, baptism can be a pretty weird thing. In some church traditions, they sprinkle a baby, just like sprinkle some water on their head, and that means something. In other contexts, like here, we submerge people underwater, just like under, Like one time I was talking to someone, we were talking about how long to keep them under for, and I was like, until God tells me to let them up. But really, like, why do we do that? If you do that at the village pool, you're gonna get time out. You can't plunge someone under the water. But here, for us, it means something, and it's even something that we celebrate here. So why baptism? Like I said, some traditions, they sprinkle. Other traditions, other church settings, they submerge people here. Before we go into like why baptism, and I know everyone in here like woke up this morning thinking like, oh, I really want to hear about baptism, right? But before we go into it, I think it's important to recognize that if you grew up in a tradition specifically where they baptize babies, right? And you disagree with what I say, for us, that's totally fine, right? Like we consider that a secondary issue. The church, like worldwide church, has been disagreeing about this for a long, long time. And the last thing we want is a secondary issue to get in the way of the growth of your own personal faith. And so if you like feel some kind of feeling of betrayal because we're talking about baptism in a way that you're not used to, feel free to like totally check out and not listen to this. I've wrestled, my family has wrestled with those feelings of betrayal. Like, is this okay? Are we crossing the line? Have we gone too far, right? So if that's like a hang up for you, we don't want it to get in the way. But we're gonna talk about what baptism is to us. So what is the deal? What is the deal with baptism? Well, if you kind of know the story of what we believe, like the story about Jesus, what we call the Gospels, Jesus shows up, he lives this pretty amazing life, he dies the death of a criminal, and then he comes back to life, which was like his death was a big deal, him coming back to life, well, that was an even bigger deal, and then he gets together with his followers at a certain point, and he gives them an objective, he gives them a mission, what we would call the Great Commission. And here's how this is really where we understand how we're supposed to do baptism and why we do baptism. And what I think is if we really dive into it, you'll see, no matter where you are in your faith, whether you're on board or not, what my hope is that you'll see not just how important baptism is, but how exciting and even practical baptism can be for you in your own personal faith journey. So here Jesus is, right? He's with his followers. He's giving them the Great Commission. Like, I'm about to get out of here, and here are your marching orders. Here's what you gotta do. Here's your purpose, your objective. He says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me, right? Like he died, he called it. He's like, I'm gonna die, I'm gonna come back. Then he pulled it off. Like if that doesn't show us that he has the ability, the authority to do what he says he's gonna do, like then, there's not really much else, right? So he says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. He says, therefore go and make disciples of all nations. Now this word for disciples, it means student, it means learner, it means like Jesus follower. He's talking to disciples, his students, his followers. He's like, all right, you've experienced all this stuff. Like you've seen the good that has come from following me. You've experienced what Jesus called abundant life. He's like, now go and make more of yourselves. Like go show that, share that to other people. Now that you get it, it's your job to give it, right? He says, go and make disciples, not just of your little like Israel Jewish community, because that's what they were if you didn't know. He's like, to everybody out there, Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Step 2. And step 3, he says, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. Making disciples, baptizing them, teaching them, right? Now, I read that, and I'll be like totally honest with you. Some of you know I have kind of a skeptical spirit, right? I like to question things. And for a really long time, I'd look at this and I'd be like, okay, I get it. I get the make disciples. If I've experienced something really good, it makes sense for me to go, naturally, I want to go and share that with other people. Check, that makes sense to me. The teaching them to obey everything I've commanded, that makes sense. If we're going to follow Jesus, we want to know what he says, right? We want to know what he wants us to do. That part makes sense. Making disciples and teaching them. But baptism, why? Right? I'm not seeing the practical side of that. There was one point we did a baptism here. We do it at our Sunday dinners, right? If it's not at the beach baptism service. And it was great. We baptized someone. And right after, someone who was fairly new to the church came up and they were like, all right, so everything so far I have loved and understood and it's been great, but what's the deal with that? Why? It just doesn't seem to make sense. You got this mini pool, and you fill it up, and then you just plunge the woman under. What's the deal? And that's kind of where I've been. Can't we just teach them? Make disciples and just teach them. Why do we have to add something that's kind of weird, that makes us look a little bit out of touch, that makes us look a little bit strange? What's the deal? Why with baptism? I read this book not too long ago. I think I've mentioned it before. It's called The Power of Moments. By two brothers named Chip and Dan Heath. And basically what they talk about are really the power of moments in our lives. They talk about how we tend to remember our lives in moments, right? If I were to ask you, how was your day yesterday? You wouldn't play back the reel of the entire day. You'd remember little blips. If I asked you, how were the last 10 years? You wouldn't just remember everything. You'd remember little moments on the timeline of that time stamp. We remember our lives in moments. We also tend to define our lives and ourselves in these symbolic moments. There are moments in our lives that help us understand who we are and how we should see ourselves. They're moments of disproportionate influence. They're symbols, symbolic moments that tell a story. So an example of this is graduation, all right? Think about this. I personally, I don't know about you, maybe you're different, but when I graduated, I don't remember the moment that I finished. I don't remember the last assignment. I probably had a few I had to turn in later, maybe I had a meeting, maybe I had these weird requirements, whatever. But what I do remember is that symbolic moment when I walked across the stage and received the diploma. For me, that was the moment that captured the whole story of my education experience. It was a big deal. When I was in high school, when I was a senior in high school, we did the same thing, and that's what I remember. Even before that, in the school I went to, we would change seats. So the 10th graders would sit in the 11th graders' seat. It was a moment that symbolized really a story. And that moment is something that helps me understand myself. Did I go to school? Yes, I remember when I graduated, of course. Do I remember what I studied? Well, that's a different conversation. But I do remember that moment. It's the same thing with marriage. Right? When people get married, it's I don't remember the exact moment when I decided I wanted to spend the rest of my life with Allie. It was kind of a, blurry, not that I ever doubted, but what I do remember, dangerous, is the ceremony. The moment when I said, like, publicly and personally, this is a commitment I'm making for the rest of my life. It served as a symbolic moment for me, not just for everyone who watched, but also for how I understand myself. Same thing with graduation. Everyone was watching, but it also told me something about me. And baptism is the same thing. It's a symbol that tells a story. I mentioned before, we believe here that baptism is a choice that someone makes that tells the story of their decision to follow Jesus. It's a tangible way to say, yes, like, I'm on board. This is for me. I'm with him. It's a tangible expression that says something, not just to, it is a public thing, but it doesn't just say something to everybody. It says something about me that helps me to understand myself. It roots me in that decision. It's a symbol that tells a story. We don't believe that baptism is something that gets us something from God. Like, we don't believe that it's transactional, like we do something and God responds to what we did in the baptism. We believe that baptism is us responding to what God has done for us. It's like our way of saying yes, and we believe you can be baptized as soon as you have the ability to say yes. So, just pause for a minute, right? When Jesus showed up, some religious teachers a little while after him said that he turned the world upside down. Like, he just changed things. If you and I were around during the time that Jesus was around, there just would have been this constant stirring. He changed things in society, in culture, and people were drawn to him by the multitudes, like by the hundreds, by the thousands, to the point where it was difficult for him to travel. He actually had to kind of like keep things he did a secret practically because it was hard for him to get from one town to the next. People were drawn to him. You've probably heard before, he gave his life up for us. Like, he died willingly on the cross to express his love for us. And then he came back from the dead to show us he was capable of pulling off what he said he would pull off. But even while he was alive, he was offering people a vision of life, a picture of life that was hard to resist. In fact, like, according to the writers of the New Testament, really the people that had a problem with him were the people that felt threatened by his power and the attention that he was getting. But otherwise, people were drawn to him. Everyone wanted a piece of Jesus. If you bumped into him on the street, you would like him. Like, people who were nothing like Jesus liked him. And he claimed to be something extraordinary. Listen to this. He said, like, to those, and maybe you can relate to some of these categories, to people, to those who were tired of religion, of carrying around the burden of feeling like I should be, and the guilt and the shame. Jesus claimed to be the answer to that and relief from that. To those who needed hope in a world that seemed like it was falling apart. Can you relate to that? Like, to people who just didn't know what they were going to hear next. For them, it was like what was coming from Rome or what was happening to their places of worship. But for us, it's all sorts of different things, right? Like, what are we going to hear next in the news? Like, hornets, bees, sharks. Jesus claimed to be the answer for those who needed hope in an uncertain world. To those who like genuinely were trying to get it right, but knew they needed a second chance. And knew when they were asking for a second chance that they were probably gonna need a third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh chance. Like, endless second chances. Jesus claimed to be the answer to that. To those who needed to find purpose in life, to feel like there's a reason why they're there. To those who needed relief from the tormenting thoughts that race through their minds, that keep them up at night. Jesus claimed to be the answer for that. To those who needed to know that something good could come from the horrible circumstances that they've gone through, Jesus claimed to be the answer for that. To those who needed healing from an unimaginably painful past, mistakes they've made or mistakes that have been made at them, Jesus claimed to be the answer for that. And to those who needed some kind of hope for themselves and for their loved ones, like when it comes to what happens after you die, Jesus claimed to be the answer for that. He said, in so many different ways, that hunger you feel within you, like that ache within your soul, if you want to call that a hunger, I'm bread to that hunger. If you want to call that thirst, I'm water to that thirst. If you want to call that a feeling of darkness, I'm the light to that darkness. If it feels like a weariness of the soul, I am rest for your soul. He claimed to be the answer to the deepest questions of the human heart. And I remember growing up, there were times where I would hear that. Like, we call that the gospel. We call that good news. Good news. Not like a list of things to do, not another religion, not like a burden to carry, but actual good news. What one person calls an unobligated giver, giving unconditional acceptance to undeserving people. And like I said, I would hear that growing up and be like, all right, I want that. I want that. I'm in. Give me a way to say yes, to know that I have said yes. In fact, there was part of me that was really jealous of the people who were around when Jesus was around. Because if he showed up and he would say these things and then he'd be like, come, follow me. You know what they could do? They could literally be like, all right, and they would follow him. And that's how they knew. That's how they knew they were following. They could struggle, but they would still know, I'm following him. They could hesitate. They could have their doubts. They could have their questions. They could continue making mistakes. But if they ever, am I following him? Yeah, there he is. I'm still with him. We were over there. Now we're over here. I'm following him. And there was something so concrete about that they could hold on to. In fact, we hear the followers of Jesus actually say, mention a number of times, remember, we left our stuff for you. We're following you. It was a tangible step they could take to hold on to. For them, that was the symbol that grounded them in the decision that they made. This is why Jesus offers us baptism. I need a way to say, I'm in. I'm with him. I need a tangible way, so when I'm struggling, when I'm doubting, when I'm questioning, I can look back, and know, I made that decision. I remember that day. I remember what it felt like going underwater. I remember who was there. That's a point on my timeline, a symbol on my timeline that made a statement to other people, but also made a statement to me. And I know it's not as exciting as actually following Jesus and being like, hey, where are we going next? Well, you can't compare the two things. But what's amazing is what we now know about what baptism does for someone. There's research that has shown that let's say two people want to be in a relationship. They love each other and they decide, all right, let's be together forever. And one says, okay. And they make that choice and they go hand in hand, maybe buy a house together, great. We know that if they want to dramatically increase their chances of actually being together forever, the best thing they can do is get married and have a wedding. to do something that says to everyone else, but also to themselves, something that grounds them in their decision. And it's the same way with baptism. We actually have research now that shows us that when people get baptized after making a decision to follow Jesus, not after getting it all together, but making a decision to follow him, it actually changes. Like, it dramatically increases their chances of continuing to have faith later on in life, especially when they do it when they're younger, because it's a point on their timeline that helps them identify themselves. And you know what? Like, the same thing with marriage. There are days where it's hard. There are days when I don't feel it. There are days when I struggle through it. There are days when it's not the most appealing thing, but I can always look back and remember, no, that day I made a choice. It's a mark on my timeline, and it keeps me rooted in that decision. And baptism does the same exact thing. It's a gift. It's a practical way of helping us understand the decision that we've made to follow Jesus. And so, like, some questions, right, that people ask a lot. How do I know? How do I know if I'm ready to be baptized? It's pretty simple. If you believe that Jesus is who he said he is and that he did what he said he would do, if you can say you believe that, then you're ready to be baptized. Like, kind of on accident in the church, we've made baptism like a second step. Like, you can believe, but you gotta kind of like get yourself together before you're ready to be baptized. That's not something that we see in the New Testament. Baptism accompanies belief. In fact, to say you've got to get to a certain point to be baptized is like saying you've got to get yourself together before you can go to Jesus. And that's the exact opposite of what we teach. Or we could say baptism is not about the progress you've made, but the direction that you're headed. In fact, early on, when we first see baptism in the New Testament, the message is repent and be baptized. Now, don't let that word scare you, because the guy in New York City with the cardboard sign that's yelling at everybody, repent, it literally means to change your mind. It's a change of direction. It's to say, okay, at one point, like, I was the boss making all the decisions for my life, living completely for myself, but now I'm changing direction and deciding to follow Jesus. And at that change of direction is the point where we get baptized. Not after I think I got it, we've been going, now I'm ready, right? And so what that means is, if you're sitting there and like, yeah, I want to, but I'm still struggling with this, that shouldn't stop you from being baptized. Or maybe you're like, well, I don't know all the Bible stories, you know? I don't know if I believe that, like, that guy Jonah was swallowed by a whale and somehow made it out 3 days. I don't know if I can accept that. Do you believe that Jesus is who he said he is and that he did what he said he would do? If you do that, if you can say that, then you're ready to be baptized. Or maybe you were baptized as a baby. Can you be baptized? Personally, here as a church, we believe that you can. I was sprinkled as a baby in the Catholic Church, but as I got older, my beliefs changed, and we believe here that when you were baptized, it wasn't your choice. We believe you can be baptized again. Now, if you were baptized a few years ago and you had some struggles in between, we don't believe that you get baptized again to, like, redo it, because once you did it, right? But it's a choice that we make. It's a mark on our timeline that we can look back to with confidence. There's a story of a guy, Philip, who was one of the followers of Jesus right after Jesus left, and maybe this story will, like, give us some clarity, and then we're just about done. He's walking along, and he meets this Ethiopian eunuch, which is a guy from Ethiopia who worked for the queen. There's also something else about him, but that's private. But really, people who worked for the queen, they would do that so that nothing would happen between them and the queen. And so he's like riding along in this chariot and he's reading this ancient Jewish prophecy about a Messiah that would come, someone who would suffer for the people. And Philip, who is a follower of Jesus, hears him. And he like comes alongside the chariot and he's like, do you know who that's about? Like, do you understand that? And the Ethiopian is like, no, I don't. To which I'm like, isn't that great? There's someone in the Bible who doesn't understand the Bible. Like, join the club, right? And so Philip explains it. He's like, this is Jesus. Like, he's talking about Jesus. And the implication is that he believes. And here's what happens. The eunuch asked Philip, he said, tell me please, who is the prophet talking about, himself or someone else? Then Philip began with that very passage of scripture and told him the good news, the story about Jesus. As they traveled along the road, they came to some water. And the eunuch said, look, here's water. What can stand in the way of my being baptized? Philip's not like, well, do you know all the Bible stories? Like, how many verses have you memorized? Have you figured it all out? Have you kicked that bad habit? Or have you simply come to believe and made a change of direction? And so the eunuch gives orders to stop the chariot. Then both Philip and the eunuch went down into the water and Philip baptized him. Why? Look, here's water. You believe? Here's water. Let's put this point on your time. Let's remember this moment, this symbolic moment in your life. I'm going to ask the band to come back up here, but I'll leave you with this story. For me, when I was in college, I had kind of gone back and forth with my faith here and there. Like, you know, I would go to a camp or hear a sermon in a church and be like, okay, I think I'm on board with that. But then I'd struggle a little bit, or I'd have my doubts and feel like, well, maybe I didn't really quite get it. But I remember in college, when I first started dating Allie, we were talking one day and she was like, have you been baptized? And I said, no. She goes, do you believe all of this? Like, do you believe that Jesus is who he said he is and that he did what he said he would do? And I said, yes. And she said, well, then you should be baptized. Like, look, here's water. What are you waiting for? And so I did. And I remember that day. I remember the guy who did it. I remember the water. I remember it was like unsettlingly warm. I remember what I was wearing. But the thing that I remember most is what I heard when I came out of the water. I did it in front of hundreds of college students. And as soon as he pulled me up out of the water, I heard cheers, air horns, people like screaming. They weren't screaming or cheering for the progress that I made. They were cheering for the direction I was heading. They were cheering for what that decision would mean for my future, for what that symbol would mean for my relationships, for my marriage, for the way that I end up raising my kids, for the way that I view life, how it would change the way that I handle hopeless situations, how I deal with anxiety, how I wrestle with my own shortcomings and failures. They were cheering for all that decision would end up meaning for me. And so my question for you is, like, what if today you could make a decision that would affect where your faith is 5 years from now? What if you could make a decision today that would change the way you see the future? It would change what you value, change the way you handle your relationships, change how you understand your purpose in life, change how you understand yourself, something that you can hold on to when you're struggling, when you're questioning, something you can look back on with confidence and know, no, that was the day I made the decision, when I took a tangible step to say, I'm with him. What if there was something you could do, a symbolic moment you could participate in that would change your story? Would you do it? We're having a baptism service on August 21st at Venetian Shores. It is one of the coolest things I've ever been a part of. It's something that we celebrate. It's a day where we see person after person come in the water, not celebrating the fact that they're changed and that they've ditched all their bad habits and now they're perfect and now they know everything and they figured out how to be the perfect church person. No, we're celebrating the fact that they have decided to follow Jesus, that they have changed direction. We're celebrating the direction that they're headed. So if you want to make that decision, you can scan the QR code on the screen. You can go to communitychurch.net/baptism. We're going to pray in a minute. You can even do it while we're praying. And all that does is tell us that you're interested, that you're thinking about it. You're not signing anything away. There are no strings attached. This is simply something that we believe God has given as a gift to you to help you understand where you stand with him.